Good, good. But yeah, I guess because you got two classes with me on the same day. I get that you are getting probably more than the average reading load. And whenever I have to make little announcements like this one, you always get to hear them twice. This is for your benefit. I'm getting my second vaccine shot on Monday, so we're not going to come to the classroom on Monday because I remember that I didn't react well to the first one, so I'm guessing that I probably won't feel so well after the second one. I've heard that the second one is usually worse. So we will still meet, but we'll meet online, so I'll send a Blackboard link. Because I don't want to try to compress the whole first half of the Fellowship of the Ring into one class session. I feel like that would be bad. So for next time, we are reading up to chapter 6. So read the prologue, read all the shit about hobbits, and read up to the Old Forest chapter. And response paper 6 is going to be due Friday at midnight. So we're just trying to get back into our regular rhythm. And I mean, we've really only got a few weeks left of this, guys. I mean, like we're more than halfway through. So yeah. All right. So does anybody have any questions about anything? Yes, Ashlyn.
Will we be getting guidelines for our presentation soon?
You will get those soon. Yes, you will get those. In fact, I will. I'll email them to you over the weekend, and I'll let you guys make some choices as well. So you don't have to do it on something I assign you. We'll talk about it on Monday. I will also give you, so that you've got plenty of time to think about it, the assignment for paper 2 next week. Because the paper 2 will be a research assignment, so there'll be a lot more preparation involved with that. Any other questions about formal class stuff like this?
Would you possibly be willing to move up the final, or let me take the final early due to work?
Okay, talk to me about that.
When it gets closer?
Yeah, maybe when it gets closer. The thing about the final is, like, I have no control over the actual time slots that I'm given. Yeah. So I can probably arrange for you to take the final on a different, if we can get take the final earlier or at a different time, even on the same day, right? But yeah, we'll work something out to make sure everybody can take it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay. Anything else? Okay, great. So, what'd you think of the second half of this? How'd this go for you?
Really well. I found myself laughing more than rolling my eyes at Bilbo.
Yeah.
And more rolling my eyes at the dwarfs.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, he gets them out of the wood elf prison.
Sure.
He gets them down the river and manages to get them out of the barrels. He finds the door. He goes and gets, info about Smaug, and comes back, and they're just like, twiddling their thumbs, like, what are we to do? What are we to do? And it's like, he's doing more than what he was assigned to do.
Sure.
And he's definitely grown into the role a lot more. I mean, he starts off with a hood and a coat that don't fit him very well, and now he's wearing armor that was just like made for him, basically.
Yeah, and he's evolved from Hobbit into burglar, right? Mm-hmm. He's not this uncertain thing anymore, right? He's willing to call himself what Gandalf called him in that first chapter, right? So yeah, there is a definite sort of process of maturity that occurs here. But does it ever quite feel like he really belongs in this outer world of elves and heroes and wizards?
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
I don't know why I nodded. I started thinking about something else.
What were you thinking about?
What was I thinking about? It came in my mind for a second, and then it immediately went away.
It's always hard when you're put on the spot, right?
He referenced his dad a couple more times in here than he did in the first, and that's what I was thinking about. And it's like, he's not acclimated entirely to this yet.
No, there is still something of Baggins about him, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I think it might be useful, because this is the way Tolkien's creative process often worked, to think about the name Baggins, which, by the way, Gollum uses as the identifying noun for Bilbo, right? Like, he doesn't recognize him. Yeah, the Bagginses, yes. He identifies Baggins as a category or a thing, right? And that is the Baggins, right? But yeah, Baggins comes from an Anglo-Saxon compound word that means ring giver. It's something like I can't remember exactly what it was. It's something like that. So we'll just erase that because it's probably wrong. But so there's something about this particular Anglo-Saxon compound that perhaps creates this association with a character who finds a ring, right?
When he's talking to Smaug, he gives himself more titles. I am the friend of bears and the guest of eagles. I am ring winner and luck wearer. And I am barrel rider.
Yeah. And and what he's doing with Smaug, again, I think we can relate to what he was doing with Gollum, right? So pretty much all of Bilbo's riddles with Smaug are neck riddles, right? Someone who is not familiar with Bilbo or with his adventures can't answer these questions, right? Can't assign an identity to this character. So let's go to the the riddling section here with Smaug. 223, thank you.
I only know because I highlighted.
So yeah, we started like, you have nice manners for a thief and a liar, said the dragon. You seem familiar with my name, but I don't seem to remember smelling you before. Who are you and where do you come from, may I ask? You may indeed. I come from under the hill, and under the hills and over the hills my paths led, and through the air I am he that walks unseen. So I can well believe, said Smaug, but that is hardly your usual name. I am the clue finder, the web cutter, the stinging fly. I was chosen for the lucky number. Lovely title, sneered the dragon. But lucky numbers don't always come off. I am he that buries his friends alive and drowns them and draws them alive again from the water. I came from the end of a bag, but no bag went over me. True, right? When the dwarves have been bagged up and captured, he's never actually been.
And he's from Baggin.
Yeah, he's from Baggin, yeah, the cul-de-sac, yes. Those don't sound so credible, scoffed Smaug. I am the friend of bears and the guest of eagles. I am ring winner and luck wearer, and I am barrel rider, went on Bilbo, beginning to be pleased with his riddling. That's better, said Smaug, but don't let your imagination run away with you. So, does this look familiar? I mean, even like apart from the whole Gollum thing, where else have we seen something like this before? Where else have we seen a hero riddling with a dragon? Or engaged in a series of questions and answers? Yeah, exactly.
I was trying to think too.
Gotta remember the dragon's name.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, this resembles very closely Fafnir and Sigurd's conversation, right? After Sigurd has already fatally stabbed Fafnir. So there are a number of elements that Tolkien borrows from this scene, but there are also things that he changes, right? So on the one hand, there's the desire on the part of the hero to conceal his identity from the dragon. Although Sigurd does, after a little bit of questioning, give in and tell Fafnir his name, right? Now the other thing is the way the dragon sows doubt in the mind of the hero, right? If we look on the bottom of page 223, right, it says, "Very well, O Barrel Rider," he said aloud. "Maybe Barrel was your pony's name, and maybe not, though it was fat enough. You may walk unseen, but you did not walk all the way. Let me tell you, I ate 6 ponies last night, and I shall catch and eat all the others before long. In return for the excellent meal, I will give you one piece of advice for your good. Don't have more to do with dwarves than you can help." "Dwarves," said Bilbo in pretended surprise. "Don't talk to me," said Smaug. "I know the smell and taste of dwarf. Don't tell me that I can eat a dwarf-ridden pony and not know it. You'll come to a bad end if you go with such friends, thief Barrel Rider. I don't mind if you go back and tell them so from me." So Smaug is giving a little warning here to Bilbo about his friends, right? That your friends intend to betray you. Much like Fafnir warning Sigurd that Regan intended to betray and kill him, right? But there are some definite differences in this conversation as well, right? For one thing, in the situation. What has Sigurd already done in the Volsung Saga when he's riddling with Fafnir?
Dealt with Regan. No.
What has he done before he dealt with Fafnir?
Before he started riddling with Fafnir.
He had already stabbed him.
He'd already killed Fafnir, yeah. So yeah, he had already mortally wounded the dragon as they're having the conversation, right? In this case, in this case, Smaug is still very much healthy and alive, right?
Yeah.
So there's, the whole dying dragon versus live dragon situation to be dealt with. But there's another difference here as well, right? When Fafnir warns Sigurd about Regan, is he telling the truth? Yeah, Fafnir tells Sigurd the absolute truth. He has no reason to lie to him. He's already dying, right? Is Smaug telling Bilbo the truth about the dwarves?
No.
He's trying to at least get under his skin.
Yeah, he's trying to do it.
Yeah, he's planting doubts, right? But yeah, the dwarves don't actually intend to betray Bilbo, right? Or let him come to any harm. What is it? We're told a little bit further on when he goes back out to them, or maybe he's told it before. And of course now I can't find it. Right, page 213, right? When the dwarves are willing to let him go into the mountain by himself without sending anyone to help him, right? The most can be said for the dwarves is this. They intended to pay Bilbo really handsomely for his services. They had brought him to do a nasty job for them, and they did not mind the poor little fellow doing it if he would. But they would all have done their best to get him out of trouble if he got into it, as they did in the case of the trolls at the beginning of their adventures, before they had any particular reasons for being grateful to him. There it is. Dwarves are not heroes, but calculating folk with a great idea of the value of money. Some are tricky and treacherous and pretty bad lots. Some are not, but are decent enough people like Thorne and Company, if you don't expect too much. The if you don't expect too much being the key thing here, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, the dwarves do not intend to betray Bilbo. But I think it's also worth thinking about a couple of other ways that this resembles other dragon tales that we've talked about as influences here. For one thing, what does Bilbo discover about Smaug as he's examining him and questioning him?
He has a weak spot on the left side of his chest.
Yeah, like Fafnir, Smaug is weak underneath, right? The way to get at him, right, his weak spot is on his belly, or we're really on his chest, right? And I think it's also important to think about what Bilbo steals from the dragon sword. Yeah, he steals a cup, just like, yeah, the thief in Beowulf, right? Who steals a cup from the dragon's hoard, which is what excites the creature's wrath in the first place, right? So we've got this character, this weird, incongruous, childlike, low mimetic hero who really has stumbled into this world of aristocratic heroism, right? In which all of these details are drawn from these old sagas, right? Now, I think it's interesting, too, if we look at the map that begins the book here. Really, if we look at both the maps that are here presented, does Bilbo's home actually appear on either map?
Doesn't look like it.
Yeah, certainly not Thror's map, right? Which really only describes or depicts the environs of the mountain and dale.
Oh yeah, it goes as far west of the actual bigger map, the Wilderland map.
Yeah, there's an arrow that points west that says Hobbiton. But really all the map shows is the Wilderland, right? So the Hobbits are somewhere off the map. All right, Hobbits are acknowledged. But they're not in this world as depicted on these maps, right? So, one of the standard tropes of modern fantasy fiction is the map that is often printed at the beginning of the book, right? So pretty much any fantasy epic you buy comes with one, right? And Tolkien really kind of largely starts this trend. But one of the differences between the map that begins The Hobbit and the maps we tend to find in other such works is that Thror's map exists within the text, right? So we're actually given not a representation of the world as it is, right? But we're given a physical representation of an object within the story. I remember when I was a kid, there was a popular video game in the mid '80s. It was one of those several hour-long epic role-playing games. It was called Ultima 4: Quest of the Avatar. And when you began the game, the basic idea was that you had you were brought through a portal into another world, and before you're taken into the other world, This flash appears, and a cloth map, and an ankh, and 2 books, bound in some strange hide, appear in a stone circle. And packaged with the game, to make everything feel more real, were these objects, right? A little silver ankh, and a cloth map of the world, plus the 2 books described. One of them even had it was the book that had all the spells in the game in it, and instead of the title being printed out in English, it was all in these kind of this strange runic alphabet, right, to make the whole thing feel more believable, more real. And that is a lot of what Tolkien does with this kind of stuff, right? Not only with kind of like the way he reshapes these real-world legends, but also just even with the way objects within the text are treated. So a lot of this, I do want to kind of bring this to some of the arguments he makes on fairy stories, which we didn't really get to. I mentioned this last time and didn't really get to dig into this in much detail. So Tolkien argues in that essay that fantasy has 4 basic purposes, right? Or that fairy stories give us 4 basic things. Fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation. Now, these first 2 elements, the way Tolkien defines them, it's very closely tied to Romantic era art theory. So I don't know if either of you are familiar with the theories of Samuel Taylor Coleridge regarding the imagination and what he calls fancy. We did talk about this in Britlit too, but I will admit it was a while ago, right? But yeah, all of this stuff does come together, right? All of these things do intersect. So when Coleridge is talking about the imagination, he's talking about our ability to take in sense impressions, melt them down into new things, and use them to create a kind of secondary reality, right?
And fancy is more of your spin on it, and it doesn't necessarily have to rely on reality.
Yeah, well, close. Coleridge says that fancy is more like a form of memory that is emancipated from time and space, right? So fancy, all you're doing is taking sense impressions, right? Taking things you've experienced and rearranging them into different patterns. The difference between fancy and imagination is that with imagination, you're inventing something new, right? You're taking things that you know, taking things that exist, but you are making something completely original out of them. You are doing things like, say, building a secondary world or an other world. So for Coleridge, imagination is the function in which man is closest to God, right? It's a kind of imitation of the power of God. Now, Tolkien uses the word fantasy to mean more or less the same thing Coleridge means by imagination. What he's talking about is what he calls subcreation, which consists in the making or glimpsing of other worlds. For some reason I cannot spell today. And giving them the inner consistency of reality. So this speaks to both the issue of the map and some of the stuff that we were talking about last time, right? You know, these glancing references to things that are going on in the world outside of the story, right? These are all about creating a secondary world that has the appearance of reality. That there is stuff that's important that's going on that's not part of Bilbo's journey, and in fact that Bilbo has nothing to do with. There's a history that the characters within the world know that is not explicitly spelled out for the reader. Right, so all of this is about giving to Middle-earth the inner consistency of reality. Now, recovery, Tolkien defines as regaining a clear view of familiar objects. This also comes out of Romantic art theory. In his preface to one of the later editions of lyrical ballads, William Wordsworth argues that the poet's task is to defamiliarize language, right? You know, to defamiliarize mundane, everyday objects so that you can see them with fresh eyes. And in fact, you know, in a couple of his poems, he tries to do exactly this sort of thing. Like, for example, in Lines Composed Above Tintern Abbey, he is trying to, he's, you know, visiting a familiar place with his sister who's never been there before, and trying to recapture his first impressions of the place through her, right? So that's kind of what recovery does, right? You're regaining a clear view of familiar objects by defamiliarizing them in some way, by making them strange.
When did the idea of like elves being simply just like Santa's helpers, like when did that come around?
Okay, yeah, this is what Tolkien calls pigwiggenry, which is a great word. And it's taken from a character in a poem by Michael Drayton called Nymphidia, which Tolkien hates. And I think like this idea of elves being these tiny sprite-like creatures that live in flowers and ride dragonflies and things like that, that dates probably from about the early modern period. So, you know, Shakespeare's fairies, for example, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, are of two types. Right? On the one hand, you have these, you know, powerful elven lords and ladies like Oberon and Titania who appear to be of normal human size. But most of the fairies around them have these little flower names and are, by implication, you know, these kind of tiny, trivial creatures, right? So yeah, a lot of early modern representations of elves and fairies. And you know, elf and fairy are basically interchangeable words, at least up to a certain point. Elf is of Germanic origin, and fairy is of French origin, but they mean more or less the same thing.
So anything that goes outside of Tolkien's idea of an elf, or sorry, of a fairy, is essentially defamiliarizing the idea of a fairy to some extent.
Yeah, I think his depiction. Well, I think he chooses certain terminology, right? So he chooses elf instead of what would then be the more familiar fairy, in order to emphasize that these creatures are not your typical little garden fairies. He does the same thing with the dwarves, right? The usual English plural of dwarf is dwarfs. However, in Old Norse, the plural would be dwarves. So even kind of in the naming here, he's making these creatures not the familiar fairy tale representations that we come to expect, but hearkening back to myth and to earlier epic literature, perhaps to make us take these kinds of creatures more seriously, right? So I think, yeah, there is some element of recovery that's happening there, right? And in this case, it is also almost a kind of literal recovery of an older way of looking at these particular creatures. Now, escape is removal from the primary world into a secondary world. And consolation is, on the most basic level, as Tolkien puts it, the imaginative satisfaction of ancient desires. The root of all fantasy is desire, right? That there are things that you want to be in the world, things that you want to exist, and fantasy is our means of bringing these things about, creating these things. He says early in the essay that he himself desired dragons. Not dragons like next door, like in his immediate vicinity, but he wanted to live in a world in which there were such things, right? And the best way for consolation to come about is through what Tolkien calls the eucatastrophe. So, EU, is a Greek prefix that means good. So think about, for example, euthanasia is intended to, means, a good or painless death, right? Euphony in music is, a good sound. I'm trying to think of other examples and failing. But yeah, the eucatastrophe is a sudden joyous turn, right? When you least expect it, when things look their darkest, something good happens that leads to a happy ending. And his work is full of these kinds of eucatastrophes, right? The most obvious example being in the Battle of the Five Armies, the sudden arrival of Beorn and the Eagles, right? Where the hell do they come from? Who cares, right? This is a sudden, joyous turn that leads to a better ending. And through these eucatastrophes, Tolkien intends to demonstrate kind of like the workings out of a kind of something kind of like divine providence, right? The only possible explanation for these kinds of joyous turn is that, some force for good in the universe is watching out for people, right? There is no particularly good reason why the eagles should show up exactly when they do, both here and at some of the various points at which they show up in The Lord of the Rings. But, there is, in addition to the kind of unlooked for, unexpected, joyous turn there is also kind of like that majestic spectacle of eagles in flight descending upon the goblins, right?
What about with Gandalf returning, right when things are getting bad? Would
That
be a
yeah,
catastrophe?
absolutely. And that also happens pretty frequently, right? The stakes being much higher near the end of the novel when he suddenly reappears just before the battle. But yeah, this has happened before as well. He disappears and then reappears just before they're about to be eaten by the trolls, right? So sometimes these disappearances and reappearances have the effect of a kind of deus ex machina, right? Okay, it's like here's just this thing that shows up to get people out of trouble. But it doesn't quite work that way at the end, right? You know, at least not with Gandalf. Maybe a bit with the eagles. So, this is the big idea that I want you guys to remember and to keep in mind as we move into the Lord of the Rings. Because this is this is often a kind of central idea in Tolkien criticism, right? A lot of critics writing about the Lord of the Rings are particularly interested and concerned with this notion of how eucatastrophe plays out. So the other thing that I want to make sure we talk about today is, again, so like Bilbo's behavior within this, and how the text kind of juxtaposes an older aristocratic heroic world with a more modern world. And I think the place I want to start here is by talking about Lake Town and the contrasting models of leadership that we get among the Lake Men. So when the Hobbit and the Dwarves first show up in Lake Town, who's in charge?
The master.
Yes, the Master. And I know that this has nothing to do with Doctor Who, but whenever I read the word the Master, I just keep imagining the Doctor Who villain, you know, like sitting, you know, plotting his little schemes. And but this isn't the guy, right? And how is the Master selected?
Elections.
Yeah, he's elected, right? Apparently more or less democratically elected. And what criteria does it seem are usually taken into account?
Old and wise.
Okay, yeah. It's usually
Wealthy.
old, wise, and particularly wealthy. Yes. Yes, the master of the town is typically a rich man. So if we look on page 196, right, where the dwarves are brought by the guard to the master, right, then the master hesitated and looked from one to the other. The elven king was very powerful in those parts, and the master wished for no enmity with him, nor did he think much of old songs, giving his mind to trade and tolls, to cargoes and gold, to which habit he owed his position. Others were of different mind, however, and quickly the matter was settled without him. So, we're specifically told that the master is primarily concerned with matters of commerce, right? That's what he cares about. He doesn't give a shit about these old songs that predicted the return of the king of the dwarves, right? Doesn't matter. But he is, in the end, happy to help the dwarves, right on page 200. Then, for the first time, the master was surprised and a little frightened. And he wondered if Thorin was, after all, really a descendant of the old kings. He had never thought the dwarves would actually dare to approach Smaug, but believed they were frauds who would sooner or later be discovered and be turned out. He was wrong. Thorin, of course, was really the grandson of the king under the mountain, and there is no knowing what a dwarf will not dare and do for revenge or the recovery of his own. But the master was not at all sorry to let them go. They were expensive to keep, and their arrival had turned things into a long holiday in which business was at a standstill. Let them go and bother Smaug and see how he welcomes them, he thought. Certainly, O Thorin Thrain's son, O Thror's son, was what he said. You must claim your own. The hour is at hand, spoken of old. What help we can offer shall be yours, and we trust to your gratitude when your kingdom is regained. So how do his private attitudes conform to his public pronouncements.
Oh, he's a politician.
Yes, he's a politician through and through.
Yeah.
But also at the same time, he's like, we are so glad to help you, but do remember us when you take back your hall.
Yeah. But does he actually expect, does he expect Thorin to succeed? What does he think is going to happen?
Smaug's gonna eat him.
Yeah, the dragon's going to kill them, right? And then he's not going to have to worry about them anymore, right? Mm-hmm. So he's seeing a situation here where either way he wins, right? Either the dwarves, if the dwarves get rid of the dragon somehow, great, the area is safer for trade, and the dwarves will be grateful and will help out the lakemen with treasure, right?
But on the other hand, if they get eaten,
then they're not his problem anymore, right? And all of this work stoppage and partying that has occurred as they have, as they've been in town, also stops, right? So the basic point here is that the master and the system he represents and his concerns are very kind of modern and capitalist, right? In many ways, the master thinks in ways that are similar to Bilbo, but he's more selfish, right? The other thing to note here, too, is that Lake Town does exist in this wilderland, right? This outer world where heroes really do step out of old songs and things like that, right? And I think that is where we find the master's contrast with Bard, yes. So tell me a little bit about Bard. What is Bard like?
he's the captain of the archers.
Mm-hmm.
He's described as a gloomy-looking man.
Yes, he is the captain of the guard. He is grim.
And he's a descendant of noble birth.
Yes, he is descended from Girion, the old lord of Dale, who died when the dragon first came, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the thing that he uses to kill Smaug, right, is his inheritance from Girion, this black arrow. And there's something else that he has inherited from his forefathers that allows him to beat the dragon, right? What else?
He can understand birds.
Yeah.
Especially the thrush.
So that's actually something that's also taken from the Volsung saga, right? Where Sigurd could understand the speech of birds after he ate the dragon's heart. But in this case, like for Bard, it's a hereditary ability, right? So if we were to associate Bard with a particular type of government, right, where we clearly associate the master with a kind of, democracy / plutocracy, right? Ruled by merchants, ruled by a wealthy elite, right? What form of government would Bard seem to represent or to be attached to?
It's the form of aristocratic that is about the warrior king or whatever.
Yep. Aristocracy is what we were looking for. Yep. Right, where one's power and virtue are largely inherited, right? Now, we know from history that aristocracy is often a crap system, right? Because it's based on a birth lottery, and there's no guarantee that the offspring of an intelligent, energetic, and talented king is going to be as energetic, intelligent, or talented as the parent, right? Frequently, they're not. So it's kind of a crapshoot as to what you get. But which of these systems does the novel seem to endorse?
Bard.
Yeah, Bard's the hero, right? Bard is going to go back and rebuild the old city of Dale, right?
Well, I mean, it even says like the master just wanted, even when they shoot down Smaug and he crushes their town. He's trying to hoard all the resources he can to himself while Bard is going throughout and putting together camps and getting people resources. And then at the end, when Dane gives him his, 14th?
Yeah, his 14th share, yeah.
He not only gives Bilbo a share, but he spreads it out amongst his men as well.
Yeah.
And then goes and rebuilds Dale. And
the master, on the other hand...
dragon sickness. Starves to death in the west.
Yeah. Yeah, he runs off with some of the money that he's supposed to be using to rebuild the town. And goes, and I think we're also told when they first arrive at Lake Town, a little something about the structure, right? If you look on page 191, right? Not far from the mouth of the Forest River was the strange town he heard the elves speak of in the king's cellars. It was not built on the shore, though there were a few huts and buildings there, but right out on the surface of the lake, protected from the swirl of the entering river by a promontory of rock which formed a calm bay. A great bridge made of wood ran out to where on huge piles made of forest trees was built a busy wooden town. Not a town of elves, but of men who still dared to dwell here under the shadow of the distant Dragon Mountain. So, they've literally built their town on the surface of a lake, right? This is an unstable place to build a city.
That's Mexico City.
Yeah. Although, to be fair to, Mexico City occupies the same space as Tenochtitlan, the old capital of the Aztec Empire, and that spot was chosen because it was on a mountain in the middle of a lake that was thus easily defensible. Right? If their enemies attacked, they could just take the bridges away, and you couldn't get at them.
It's not doing so well for them now. But.
Well, yeah, it's environmentally problematic and so on and so forth. Yeah, but Lake Town is here represented as being built on unstable turf. Meanwhile, we're told on page 192, the rotting piles of a greater town could still be seen along the shores when the waters sank in a drought. So there's to be no doubt in our minds here that Dale, the precursor of Lake Town, right, the ancestors of the Lake Men, that Dale was greater than Lake Town is. And thus a restoration of Dale is more important than maintenance of Lake Town. At least in this part of the world, right? The concerns of Bilbo's part of the world are a little bit different. And I think this is where this is where things get complicated, right? So here in the mountain and the lake, right, the restoration of old monarchies, whether it's the king under the mountain or the Lord of Dale, right? This all seems to be very important in the way things are supposed to be. However, well, I think this, by the way, is why Bilbo's little ploy with the Arkenstone ultimately fails, right?
Yeah, that was just, I understood why he did it, but at the same time, that was super shady and really crappy of him to do, because it was the one thing Thorin wanted. He valued that more than any amount of gold under the mountain. because it was not only the heart of the mountain, but it was a representation of his family.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, you just
Yep.
took his family, you took an heirloom
Uh-huh.
and used it as a negotiation.
Now,
tool.
to be fair, he does intend for them to try to trade it back to
Yeah.
Thorin, right, in exchange for peace.
But also at the same time, he kind of betrays them because
Mhm.
he knew he was looking for this, and he hid it in his pillow.
Yeah.
And even when Thorin says, "Whoever, if I find someone has it,
Mm-hmm.
woe is them," essentially.
But I think this is one of the places we're talking about, like, kind of a different set of values, right?
Mm-hmm.
For Bilbo, averting a war is a higher value than heredity or a magic jewel, right? And I think, that Thorin is, by this point, kind of very much taken with the dragon sickness, right? With, the power of the treasure over him. Smaug's curse working its way through him. So yeah, we are talking about, like, this is another one of those places where Bilbo references his practical father a lot, right? As my father used to say, third time pays for all, some other sort of formulaic cliche. So we have that practical world of the West, right? That's not on the fantasy map, interacting here with the heroic world of dwarves and elves and wizards. And I think that there is some endorsement of Bilbo's preferred way of life on page 290 as he's having his conversation with Thorin as Thorin's dying, right? Now, Thorin says, "There is more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West. Some courage and some wisdom blended in measure. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But sad or merry, I must leave it now. Farewell." So the values of comfort and prosperity in a modern commercial world are not entirely devalued here, right? But what I'd like to finish up, because we've got about 10 minutes here, what I'd like to finish up on is the notion of what all this does to Bilbo, right? So we get the future fates of just about all of these characters, right? Bjorn becomes a chieftain. This guy who lives alone on a rock in the wilderness turns into a bear and kills goblins now and again. Suddenly has other bear people who come and join him. Bard becomes Lord of Dale. The master disappears into the wilderness and dies. What's that?
Good riddance.
Bilbo returns home. And what does he find when he gets back?
The Saxville Bagginses are trying to move in, and people are auctioning his stuff.
Yeah, he's been gone for a year, and he's presumed dead. Yeah, and here we have again one of the problems, a kind of satire here on modern legalistic society, right? Look on page 30. If we look on page 303, or page 302, right? And so they crossed the bridge and passed the mill by the river and came right to Bilbo's own door. "Bless me, what's going on?" he cried. There was a great commotion, and people of all sorts, respectable and unrespectable, were thick round the door, and many were going in and out, not even wiping their feet on the mat, as Bilbo noticed with annoyance. If he was surprised, they were more surprised still. He had arrived back in the middle of an auction. There was a large notice in black and red hung on the gate, stating that on June the 22nd, Messrs. Grubb, and Burrows would sell by auction the effects of the late Bilbo Baggins, Esquire, of Bag End, Underhill, Hobbiton. Sale to commence at 10 o'clock sharp. It was now nearly lunchtime, and most of the things had already been sold for various prices from next to nothing to old songs, as is not unusual at auctions. Bilbo's cousins, the Sackville Bagginses, were, in fact, busy measuring his rooms to see if their own furniture would fit. In short, Bilbo was presumed dead, and not everybody that said so was sorry to find the presumption wrong. The return of Mr. Bilbo Baggins created quite a disturbance both under the hill and over the hill and across the water. It was a great deal more than a 9 days' wonder. The legal bother indeed lasted for years. It was quite a long time before Mr. Baggins was in fact admitted to be alive again. The people who had got specially good bargains at the sale took a deal of convincing, and in the end, to save time, Bilbo had to buy back quite a lot of his own furniture. Many of his silver spoons mysteriously disappeared and were never accounted for. Personally, he suspected the Sackville Bagginses. On their side, they never admitted that the returned Baggins was genuine, and they were not on friendly terms with Bilbo ever after. They really had wanted to live in his nice hobbit hole so very much. So we've got here a different kind of selfishness, right, than we saw among the dwarves and the master of Lake Town, right? We've got a kind of provincial selfishness here. Right? They have no concept of the world outside of their tiny village that Bilbo has just been in, right? So the most important things to them, the things they value most, are little creature comforts and property within their village, right? Getting more of that sort of thing. Exactly the sorts of things that Bilbo valued most before he left on his journey, right? Why are the Sackville Bagginses pissed that their cousin is still alive? Because it means they didn't get to live in his house, right?
Yeah. Isn't Frodo a Sackville Baggins?
He is not. No. The Sackville Bagginses are a different line. Frodo is a product of a marriage between a Baggins and a Brandybuck.
That's right.
Yes.
I just want to sit down and just go through, because Merry and Pippin are also related to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Samwise is not related to the others because he's a working class hobbit.
He's the gardener.
But yeah. Most of the well-to-do hobbits are cousins at the very least, right? They're related in some way. But if we proceed on from here, right? Indeed, Bilbo found he had lost more than spoons. He had lost his reputation. It is true that forever after he remained an elf friend and had the honor of dwarves, wizards, and all such folk as ever passed that way, but he was no longer quite respectable. He was in fact held by all the hobbits of the neighborhood to be queer, except by his nephews and nieces on the Took side, but even they were not encouraged in their friendship by their elders, right? So his adventures in the outside world have made him look weird to his respectability-obsessed neighbors, right? So what does it seem to mean to be respectable?
Be boring.
For a hobbit? Yeah, to be boring.
Also, he might also, you say, socially, he's considered to appear strange, but also maybe physically, because, he got his hair scorched. He doesn't have any hair on his feet.
That's true. Yeah. It takes some time for it to grow back, yeah. Certainly longer than it would have taken him to get back from the mountain.
And he got knocked on the head, so he's probably got some type of bandaging on his head.
Yeah. And from all this adventure, he's probably relatively buff for a hobbit, right?
Or thin.
Or emaciated, yeah.
He's got a sword.
Yeah.
Pony's leg.
He's got a little coat of mail, right? Yeah. He doesn't fit into Hobbit world anymore, right? He doesn't fit into the mold of his predictable father, even though it was elements of his father's personality that helped him to navigate this other world without losing a sense of himself. So what we end up with here is a kind of almost a kind of hybrid, right? Which was suggested in the beginning by the Baggins Took heritage, right? The boring, respectable, predictable Baggins combined with the eccentric, adventure-loving Took side, right? So it seems like what has happened over the course of these several chapters, of this year of his adventures, is that this original potential has been taken and developed through being tested in the outer world. But even so, right, there's a reminder at the end of this that he is not the most important thing in that world, right? Yeah.
A little fellow in a wide world after all.
Yeah, this is the last thing Gandalf says on page 305, right? Right. Of course, said Gandalf, and why should not they not prove true? Surely you don't disbelieve the prophecies because you had a hand in bringing them about yourself. You don't really suppose, do you, that all your adventures and escapes were managed by mere luck just for your sole benefit? You are a very fine person, Mr. Baggins, and I am very fond of you, but you are only quite a little fellow in a wide world after all. So, while Bilbo has been the center of this story, right, one of the implications here is that he's not the center of Middle-earth, right? He's not the center of the whole world. And one thing that we have to remember when we read this is that, again, like the Lord of the Rings plot had not yet been invented or developed. Now, we will find that in fact, Bilbo's little ring is the center of the world. That is the most important thing in the world.
Well, and even Gandalf says, because I think Bilbo asked him, where have you been this whole time? And he tells him that he had met with other white wizards to get rid of the necromancer.
Yes, to drive him out of his old stronghold, right? And he's just going to go back into his even older stronghold and dig himself in there.
Well, we have the story of Bilbo and the Great Journey. There's also all these other small stories.
There's something arguably more important going on off screen. Yeah. And I also I think that was another I don't want to keep coming back to criticism of the Peter Jackson Hobbit movies, but I think that was also a mistake to show that off-screen action that was going on, because I think part of, again, what makes the world of the novel believable is these other things are going on in the background, but they're not put right in front of you. And again, that kind of helps to reinforce the point that this isn't really all about Bilbo. And in fact, when we get to the Lord of the Rings, too, it's not really about Frodo or Sam either, just as it hasn't really been about Bilbo. There are going to be some points at which Frodo and Sam have some conversations about the old stories and feeling like you're in a story. And I think that we can kind of connect some of that back to this last comment of Gandalf's about you being only a little fellow in a wider world.
I'm excited. I've read this before, and it's been a while, but when I started reading it, that little first line, and a hole in the ground, I started giggling and just getting so excited. I was like, oh. Could you also describe, we described a Hobbit hole as a womb. Could you describe the Misty Mountains as a womb in a way? Because it's warm and it's safe to a certain degree.
Yeah, except it's not, right?
Except it's not. Well,
although he does pass through a tunnel, right?
Yeah.
He passes through a whole bunch of tunnels. And each time he comes out changed,
describe, I want to say more, maybe not like a womb, but like a body.
Okay.
Because there's different sections for each thing. You have the center where Smaug and the majority of the treasure is, and then you have, this is where the ravens used to stay.
Yeah.
This is where the feast hall is. This is where the guard's room is.
To get back to Smaug there for a second, right? Remember too that we talked about the dragon living in his hole in the ground on a pile of treasure as a kind of negative example of what somebody like Bilbo could be, right?
Yeah.
But I also just want to note quickly that the name Smaug is taken from two Anglo-Saxon root words, or it's theorized it's taken from two. One is smilken, which means to smoke. And the other is smoogen, which means to cram or to stuff.
And they're both verbs, they're not just nouns?
They're both verbs, yep.
Is that
Were they able to,
smoogen?
were they
Or
able to
smell?
smoke in Anglo-Saxon? Or?
Oh, and they're not talking about like smoking a pipe. They're just talking about like a fire
Okay.
smoking. Yeah.
Just okay, I got it.
Yeah, that is actually like one of. Well, you know, we might talk about this a little later too, but like very little of what we find in Middle Earth is something that you wouldn't have found in medieval England, with a couple of exceptions. Potatoes.
Boil and mash and put them in a stew.
Yeah, exactly. and tobacco. Yeah, tobacco is a. Yeah, these are both New World crops.
Yeah.
That don't appear in Europe until the early modern period. But yes, all right. So let me give you the reading questions for next time. And we shall embark once again from Bag End on Monday, but not from this room.
Oh, yeah.